I'm making my guest's favorite drink.
You picked a mojito, Vesper Martini,
The House of Balloons cocktail.
Nice and crisp.
Join me and some of the world's greatest writers.
multi-award-winning author of 5 novels, best-selling author of more than 20 books, the Pulitzer Prize among many other awards. Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today we're with Seth Wickersham. Seth is a senior writer for ESPN, where he began 25 years ago. His investigative journalism has broken stories in the NFL, including Spygate and Deflategate. He's done in-depth profiles on Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Bill Walsh, Bill Belichick, and many others. He's also a best-selling author. His first book, It's Better to Be Feared, took a close look at the New England Patriots dynasty. And his new book is American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. And I ripped through this book. It was so good. It was just right in my wheelhouse for sports history and consumption, and like great insights too.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Welcome to the show. And we're going to have some delicious Johnny Walker Blue Label today. So I'll put that on a couple of ice cubes, I guess.
Sounds good.
All right. Like 3.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I'm glad you did the little ice cubes. Like, people are always like, are you one big ice cube or many little ice cubes? And I always prefer the little ones.
A little more flexibility.
Yeah.
Like with Scotch, that makes some sense.
Exactly.
With, when we had like a Negroni, we went big ice cube. Like slow down the melting a little bit.
Thank you for splurging on this.
My pleasure. Actually, I was excited about this because I've never had Johnny Walker Blue before. All right, more where that came from. All right, cheers, Seth.
Cheers, thank you. Great to meet you.
Smooth.
It is. That's that's the allure, right?
I can just picture you in like the sports booth with the hat that says "Scoop," drinking some Scotch.
Right. I know. Playing to type.
Yeah. So you've been out with this book a couple of weeks, and you've done some great media on it. So I had the pleasure of watching some of your earlier interviews with people like Dan Patrick, and those were great. So I did learn through that you're born in Colorado, moved to Alaska, and have played some quarterback yourself.
I did. Well, it's, first of all, thanks for having me. This is awesome. And I did, people are always asking, what inspired you to write the book? And I did play a little bit of high school quarterback in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm trying not to come off in my interviews like the Alaska Uncle Rico, although I do at times. But I think that, there's a couple big things that happened in my life and that I've observed covering the NFL as long as I have and working at ESPN that really motivated me to want to, write a book about quarterbacks, because, a lot of books have been written about quarterbacks. And as as an author, you have to figure out, number one, why does my book exist? And number two, why am I the one to write it? And, I did the best I could, and hopefully those themes came across in there. No,
it's awesome. I mean, we'll do a whole bit on the book in a bit, but I did love it because not only does it get the history of it, which I didn't know most. I mean, going back to the Jane Russell days of the Cleveland Rams moving to be the LA Rams, and all of that stuff was fascinating. But you also got deep into the things that aren't readily apparent about what makes a quarterback successful in the psyche. I mean, it helps to be a bit of a narcissist, as it turns out. To be so that's sort of in the way Michael Lewis can kind of find these unseen or underappreciated forces that drive success. You got into that, but we'll save that for a bit. So you leave Alaska for Missouri undergrad, and I think you were there in like the Quinn Snyder days of the hoops team. It was more of a basketball school maybe in those days?
It was just coming on as a football school. And so it had a really long run. I think that when I was there, they made a bowl game in 1997. So that was my second year there. And I think it was their first bowl game since 1982, if I remember right. And so it was kind of cool to be there for a little bit of a renaissance. And the quarterback at Mizzou at the time was this really nice guy named Corby Jones. And, we became friendly. It was cool to kind of just see that up close, that kind of turnaround. Norm Stewart was the basketball coach when I was there, definitely more of a basketball school than a football school. And Quinn came at the very end.
Okay. Did you know in these years that you were heading toward a career? So ESPN was founded in 79, which I looked up. But by the the 90s, early 2000s, it was a behemoth.
Mm-hmm.
And did you know that's where you wanted to go?
No. So I knew. So I go to Mizzou to study journalism. I didn't go halfway across the country to Missouri for the skiing. That's for sure. And I did a lot of. When I got there, I knew I wanted to work in sports, and the question was, do you write or do you do TV? At the time, you kind of had to choose. So I did both for a bit, and then I really love doing magazine stories.
Was there like a school?
There's different disciplines. There is, and it's KOMU, and you're what differentiated Mizzou, maybe still, but definitely at the time, was that you kind of worked on these professional commercial outlets as a student, and the people who you worked with were paid editors or paid managers, and so or producers, and so. That was the draw. So you kind of like get this, it was almost like a trade school. Mm-hmm. And I was just drawn to magazine stories. And that's, I wrote a lot for the newspaper, but what I really wanted to do was write magazine stories. And when I was there,
because it's longer form.
Yeah, I loved the ability to just get as deep as I could. And when I was at Mizzou, ESPN magazine launched. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh, that's cool. Like that would seem like a good place to work. And my senior year, one of my best friends who was a student at the time, his name is Wright Thompson. He works at ESPN with me, and he wrote a book called Pappyland. So I feel like that he's destined to be at this desk at some point soon.
Good.
But about Pappy Van Winkle. But the St. Louis Rams made it to the Super Bowl against the Titans our senior year. And he got the idea. We had covered a couple of Rams games just so you could say you had done it. And he got the idea to apply for credentials to the Super Bowl, even though we were students. And sure enough, the NFL granted us credentials. So we went to the Super Bowl in college. And
as journalists.
As journalists.
In theory.
Yeah, but it was like a blast. We were meeting, it's like a sports media convention. So you're meeting all these people that you had only read or seen on TV. And then one day I was in the media center and I recognized someone from across the way, and it was the editor-in-chief of ESPN magazine, this man named John Papanek. So I went and introduced myself to him, and I, said something like, I'm going to be writing for you one day or whatever. And it wasn't like that didn't help me get a job, but they happened to have an opening before I graduated. And so I want to say a week after graduation, I was in New York City. And
so how does one become a sports writer? Do you submit your body of work and things
I did
for the student paper?
Yeah, I'd done some internships too. So I'd submitted, a range of stuff. And, I think it was just kind of fortuitous that it all kind of came together when it did. But yeah, a couple days after my first day, I was at Yankee Stadium, writing, reporting something to write. So I was like, it seemed like Anchorage, Alaska was a really, really long way away from there. Yeah. It was pretty wild.
It's amazing the access you have that comes through in your pieces, in the book. I mean, I think you'd already, by the time you sat down for this book, you knew the gamut in the NFL from Y.A. Tittle mm-hmm. and Johnny Unitas all the way to Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, and then young guys coming right out of college. So you had such a broad swath of the mm-hmm. history of the quarterback. I mean, really from the very beginnings, it was amazing. You have also covered other things. You've done like horse racing mm-hmm. and other stories too, but you're mainly NFL?
Yeah, it's like majoring in the NFL and minoring in other things. Yeah. But the NFL is the sport that Americans care about most and know about least. And so that's always been my goal, is to help shrink that gap as best I can.
Why is that? Why do they know about it the least?
I think because it's just, maybe it started, especially in the last, the Parcells and Belichick era, but it's just gotten so secretive. Mm-hmm. And, Parcells used to say, we're not in the information sharing business, we're in the information gathering business.
And that's different from baseball, for example.
Baseball is wide open. Basketball is wide open.
In what way? Like how the locker room
just for like when you cover baseball, you get to the park and as a reporter, you hang around, you visit with the players before the game, you visit with them after the game. In the meantime, you can talk to the manager, talk to anybody on the field. It's just a very open atmosphere, and the NFL is the opposite of that. I mean, when Bill Belichick ran the Patriots, anybody who wasn't on the football operations staff didn't have a key card that granted them access to that area. Like if you were a Patriots employee, like he was siphoned off within the organization because the things that they were talking about and discussing and analyzing.
There's so much more sophistication and intellectual property around how to win a game. Like in baseball, you can hit a baseball or you can't. You're going to score runs or you're not. And you're a great pitcher. It's more down to like execution as opposed to the NFL. It's like there's very sophisticated plays and they got to keep that.
I would like to say that but in a weird way, I think I've seen enough to think that maybe that's a little bit too much credit. I think it's just paranoia, I think it's so hard to win. Like I once asked this coach, like, who's a great NFL coach, like how many players do what they're supposed to do on any given play? And he was like, 3, and it's like human beings, are like, there's so much choreography and strategy and insight. And yet this still comes down to human beings. And I think that like the facade of coaching is that you can control this. And it's also, I think, the biggest misnomer of it. And it often, comes back to the people with the ball in their hand, like quarterbacks.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the quarterback in the NFL. So, as the 20th century begins, clearly the American sport is baseball. It's America's pastime. It's way bigger. As we get through the 20th century, baseball diminishes a bit and the NFL just becomes a juggernaut. It's just the biggest. And then within that, as you point out here, the true sports icon in America is the quarterback. It's no longer the baseball slugger or the heavyweight prize fighter. Like I couldn't even tell you who the heavyweight champion of the world is right now, but I can name a bunch of quarterbacks. So I love the book for that reason. And you sort of diagnose the position. And as I was alluding to Michael Lewis, I know you guys are buds as well. It does have that feel of a Michael Lewis book of like, here are the things, here's sort of the sauce that you might not realize is part of what makes a quarterback.
Thank you.
Quarterback great.
Well, what I wanted,
like a little counterintuitive, really. But.
Right. So what I wanted to do with it was like show. It's a very unique job. Like I was sitting with Steve Young, Hall of Famer for this book, great quarterback, and he's one of the few quarterbacks who can articulate quarterbacking. Like most of them, it's like Magic Johnson would talk about as a coach. He was so frustrated because he'd just see things and nobody else saw them. And he couldn't figure out how to explain that. Steve Young's one of the few quarterbacks who can articulate great quarterbacking. And I asked him at one point, what are all the hats you have to wear as a starting quarterback for an NFL team? And he leans back in his chair and he just starts rattling them off. Matinee idol, field general, amateur psychologist, spokesperson for a multi-billion-dollar organization, breathtaking asshole, cheerleader, all these things. He stopped at like 17. And then as we kept talking, he would add in more because it was still on his mind. And I think that like that's...
Would he ever, it'd be interesting to see a side-by-side of that and, point guard on an NBA team versus,
Well, that's what makes quarterbacks so unique is that they don't exist like that. Like if you're Messi, even if you're the face of a soccer club, you don't have to do all those things. And, oh, by the way, you also have to be able to deliver the ball into these windows that most people can't see, much less throw a ball through. So it's just always been a unique job with very unique responsibilities. And I wanted to explore what it meant to do it in high school, in college, in the NFL level, what it's like to live with it after you've done it as you're a retired Hall of Famer.
That's a fascinating piece of the book.
Yeah. I actually enjoyed doing that so much. And I wanted to understand what it was like now and throughout history. And so, those were my goals.
And it does have elements that anyone can relate to in a way, not to just pitch the book, but it's like Joe Montana retires, and it has that same feel of like, what does a president of the United States do after they leave office? You've got all this, especially if you were young, you've got all these decades before, and it's like, the prime is clearly behind me. Like I did all this crazy. Now Staubach and some others have gone on to do like enormous, incredible things in their next act after the NFL. But for most people, it's like once you've been in the big show of the NFL as the quarterback of a big team, it's tough to sort of figure out what you're going to do next. First of all, because you've had such a programmed life. You've never had to schedule your own time, your diet, your exercise, your sleep. It's all like, this is what you're going to go do. And then you've got to like figure that out on your own.
The self-identity aspect of it is one of the subtexts of the entire thing. And I knew from how the the job took over my identity as a kid in Anchorage, Alaska, to know enough, like to wonder, like, what is it like for these guys who do it at the highest level? Mm-hmm. Because you don't just play quarterback, you are one. And that's another difference between it and shortstop or point guard. It's a lifestyle in a weird way. And so I know that when you leave that and whenever your playing days are done, you don't just leave that persona behind. And so how those guys deal with it, I thought was really fascinating. Some of them deal with it by, running away from it as fast as they can. Like Roger Staubach, he got into real estate. He ran away from who that person was. Mm-hmm. And you have other guys who really struggle to figure out what's next and to see who they are if they're not a quarterback. And so that part of it was really, really fascinating.
Someone like Elway was sort of working to sort of figure out the next act more than some others. By the way, I love some of the interpersonal sort of sniping and rivalries between some of the greats. Elway is just a phenomenal athlete. One of the few who was, the best in the country in high school, best in the country in college, and then goes on ultimately to have an amazing NFL career and be a first ballot, I think, Hall of Famer. Mm-hmm. But he and Marino came out in the same class, like one of the famous, I think, 83 class coming out of college, which was, loaded with amazing quarterback talent. And those two, I think Marino says something like, geez, your release point's really low. Like something, criticizing Elway's quarterbacking. And Elway, meant to be, I guess, a little joking, but Elway was like, that son of a bitch,
Oh, totally pissed. Well, so like these guys, we talk about athletes and we say they're hyper competitive, and really that's a euphemism for being spectacularly unbalanced and petty and immature and almost crybabies in some ways. And so Elway and Marino came up through college together, and they were on an All-American tour, and they were having a competition to see who was on more preseason magazines. And there was one where they were both on. And what makes it funny is that Marino is actually running in his picture, which of course anyone who ever watched Dan Marino play,
not his thing. Yeah.
Not his thing. And Elway's in the pocket throwing, and Marino looks at his release and was like, your arm's pretty low. And, Elway, of course, was born as the greatest it's like the greatest quarterback that God ever invented. And so that annoyed him. And then throughout their career, they were friendly and competitive. And when Dan Marino retired, he had a party down in Fort Lauderdale for just the class of 83 quarterbacks. So there were 6 taken in the first round. 3 were first ballot Hall of Famers, Elway, Marino, and Jim Kelly. And it was the first time that entire group had been together ever, which was crazy to think about. And they laughed and they told stories, and none of them were playing anymore. And so the pressure was kind of off. But even in that atmosphere, Elway would say that we still weren't letting any trade secrets out, just in case you happen to come back.
In case you get the call.
Exactly.
Let's talk about, I picked a couple moments of history of the NFL and quarterbacking where there were sort of these step changes in the league becoming what now is sort of unquestionably America's pastime. So getting back all the way to the 40s, you've got Waterfield, the quarterback for the Cleveland Rams, right? And he has a marriage ultimately with Jane Russell, who's Hollywood's hottest starlet at the time. And so he's the handsome, rugged quarterback, all-American guy in the 40s when the NFL was a thing, but nowhere near what, what the Yankees and Major League Baseball were. But suddenly this relationship gives access to, a huge amount of press coverage. And so the owner of the Rams decides to move the team to LA somewhat in connection with this relationship.
I mean, I don't know if they were the country's first quote unquote power couple, but they were among the first. And he, quarterback, when I started researching the history of quarterback, not the history of the forward pass, but the history of the position, I thought that it would be like a slow burn from this job being invented in 1880 to it being celebrated and kind of people looking up to it on par with the other lofty jobs that our country has to offer. And what surprised me was how fast it happened. Really, especially after the forward pass was legalized in college football, it took off. Quarterbacks became...
What year was that?
1906. And so quarterbacks, especially in college, but then slower in the NFL, once the NFL got going in the 30s, just became superstars on par with politicians and movie stars. So out of LA comes Bob Waterfield and Jane Russell. They meet in high school at Van Nuys High, America's high school, as it turns out. They both, he went to UCLA. And he was running with Frank Sinatra. You know what I mean? Like his social circles as a student, as a quarterback at UCLA were astounding. He goes to the Rams. They win a championship in Cleveland his rookie year. They move the team 3 weeks later, in part because the owner, this man named Dan Reeves,
in relation to the
coach
Reeves
no.
Okay.
But like he saw these two American forces on the ascent. Hollywood in the golden age, and football, even though it took a while, he saw its popularity coming. And so they go to LA, and parties at their house became legendary. They lived right over the Hollywood Hills. It overlooked the valley. And I mean, it was ground zero for the best football players and the best celebrities coming there and drinking and partying. And their relationship, I kind of follow their relationship until he's on the deathbed, even past it. And, they went through it all. I mean, they had, huge fights. They had epic affairs. They had incredible drinking, matches and fights because of that. And, they eventually got divorced, but even after they got divorced, they never really emotionally left each other. And I thought that was one of the most kind of fascinating things, because it shows that even though they were so famous and their lives were so scrutinized for the time, really they were two people who met in high school who kind of fell in love. And even though they didn't make it as a couple, they were experiencing a type of fame and American life. And they were the first ones to kind of go through that. And I think that there's no room to process or to think or to consider. You just kind of it happens to you, and then you go back later and you realize what happened.
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, for present day people, it's probably something to study. Like Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, watch that for what to do, and not that they need help, but that's certainly an example of what crazy fame can do, and in some cases go a little wrong. But another stepping forward a few years.
Travis Kelce, by the way, was a high school quarterback. So there you go.
Did he play quarterback?
He did. Wow. In case you're wondering, what she sees in this dopey tight end, he was a high school quarterback. So.
He's got all the other charm
yes.
Elements of a QB. So a few years into the future, Y.A. Tittle, who played against Waterfield in a few years, takes the cover of Sports Illustrated in 1952. First quarterback, maybe first NFL player.
First NFL player on the cover.
Illustrated.
Yep.
So that's a huge moment for the league and sort of stepping up, because previously it would just be baseball players and whatnot.
Yeah, baseball players and yachts and horses. That's who was in college football, And so the NFL was still coming, and Y.A. Tittle was the first NFL player on the cover of Sports Illustrated. They didn't even put his name. You just knew or you didn't. And he was with the 49ers at the time. And Tittle was interesting to me. So if Bob Waterfield was the guy who showed you the quarterback can get the girl, right? Tittle was the guy who was the first one who was looked at as a failure for his team's failures. And that to me was fascinating, because who's the first person we blame when the team loses? The quarterback. I mean, we break them down.
Big one.
Yeah, we break, just yesterday, Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes are playing, and Josh Allen has that asterisk. Yeah. No matter how well he plays, we know that what matters for him is not a regular season win against the Chiefs. It's what happens in January. Yeah. So Tittle was a phenomenal player, and he was a first ballot Hall of Famer, but he's been a little erased by history because he couldn't quite win an NFL championship. And in 1962, he had one of the best years ever for a quarterback that's been forgotten by history. He threw 36 touchdown passes in 12 games. He completed 63% of his passes in 1962. I mean, Joe Montana was hitting that in the 80s. I mean, this guy was 2 decades more accurate than other people, than his peers. And they make it to the championship game that year. And it's a tough game, but he throws this perfect pass into the end zone and his receiver drops it. And
that's the difference.
That's the difference. And after that, he returned for one more year thinking this will be our year. And he ends up throwing an interception, getting crushed against the Steelers, broke his sternum, got his helmet knocked off. And there's this famous picture taken of him where he's on his knees. He's got blood snaking down his forehead. His helmet's knocked off. And he just looks like a beaten, defeated person. And really, like, that defined him. But like, his career was actually anything but. And so that's what made him so unique to me, and unique with the idea of a quarterback, because he was the precursor to like Fran Tarkenton and Jim Kelly and these other guys who were great but couldn't quite get over the hump.
Yeah. I mean, the other reason we don't remember him, I think, is the name, like Tittle. It's not that, like, it's not like Johnny Unitas or Joe Montana. I mean, that's a name.
You got to have it. You got to have great, to be a great quarterback. I kind of think you have to have a great quarterback name.
Yeah.
And when I was with Y.A. Tittle before he passed, he was so friendly and warm and loving, but he had deep dementia. And we would talk, and, you know, he would cycle through his memory loop, and he couldn't remember who I was. So he would say, you know, he'd be laughing and telling a story. And who are you again? Seth Wickersham. And he'd go, Seth Wickersham? That's a worse name than Yelverton Abraham Tittle. I'm like, he still had it, like, even back then.
Yeah, it's like that Point Break with Keanu. It's like Johnny Utah. Like, that's,
yes.
That's a good name. With Montana, you write in the book that he lost something, or maybe he feels he lost something with Brady's incredible achievements. That now Brady's the greatest of all time. Did he really? Do you think he feels that way, or as a sports reporter, do you feel he has actually lost something given what Brady did?
I think that, like, almost all of these guys, you know, as time erodes their accomplishments and new people come in, they start to, like, you know, think about why their accomplishments are not being appreciated quite as they were. And there's no question that Joe Montana is interesting because he's so great. And yet every coach that he ever had, from high school to at Notre Dame to Bill Walsh and George Seifert of the 49ers, wanted to replace him. And
he's not the most athletic quarterback. He's one of the least athletic quarterbacks.
He isn't, but like, his greatness is you know, unmatched, or was unmatched at the time, and yet he could never understand why. Like, why do these coaches want me gone? And so he will always feel like things ended at the 49ers when he was traded to the Chiefs. They ended in a bad way, and that he'd lost some of the best years of his career. Now, he was injured for some of them, but other times they wanted to move on to Steve Young, and they did. But he was so far ahead of his game as a quarterback. So there's this moment in the book where I talk about where Mike Shanahan, whose son Kyle coaches the 49ers now, is brought into San Francisco as the offensive coordinator. And so he goes back and he studies this revolutionary West Coast Bill Walsh offense. And he meets with each of the quarterbacks that they have on the roster for 2 days each, because he wants to learn from them, each by themselves. So he meets with Steve Young, who's the starter, and then Joe Montana and Steve Bono, who's the third string guy.
Wait, did Montana stick around as the backup for a while?
He was forced to for a bit. He was injured and then kind of the backup, but he was never given a chance to compete for the job again, that he lost due to injury. I forgot about that. Yep. And so he's on the roster, but he's like really suspicious of everybody because he can tell that the 49ers want him gone. And so Shanahan, who had just gotten there, calls Montana back and he says, you know, I got to talk to you because you look at the West Coast offense differently than all these other guys. Like, I don't understand. And Montana was like, yeah, I was kind of hoping you wouldn't notice that. And he goes, look, everybody else goes as Bill Walsh, the genius, drew it up. Reads 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's what Steve Young does. He ends up holding the ball too long and takes a lot of sacks or fumbles and gets hit a lot because of it. I go by what I see from the defense. And if I go straight to read number 4, that's what I do. And if he's covered, I look at the outlet. And if he's covered, I throw the ball away. And I look to fight another down. But he said, you can't tell Steve about this because this is my edge. So Shanahan promises he wouldn't. And so then they play that season and Montana's traded to the Chiefs in the offseason. And Shanahan calls in Steve Young and he goes, we're never going 1 through 5 again.
Here's what we're doing. That's funny.
But Joe
he kept his word though until...
He kept his word. Yeah. But like, it's just true because it's like, it shows that even for the greatest coaches, The quarterback's the one with the ball in his hands, and it ultimately comes down to their magic.
Yeah.
And the second thing that makes it so interesting is that, like, Joe will always feel raw about those years and always feel like that Brady might have 7 Super Bowls, but he could have gotten there if they had kept that team together and if he had been given a chance to play.
It's like back to your Y.A. Tittle thing. It's like one other player's thing. And you have that great scene in the book where there are a whole bunch of quarterbacks sitting around. The check comes and Montana's there. It's like, anyone with less than, 3 Super Bowls has to pick up the tab. And they're all like, oh.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened. So one of the things with quarterbacks is that, like, they know how to turn the knife. Mm-hmm. They know how to slide the knife in you and they know how to turn it. And so what happened was that John Elway, Joe Montana, Johnny Unitas, and Dan Marino were all retired and they were all doing a Walmart sponsorship. So they go out to dinner and Joe Montana, the check comes and Montana says, anyone here without a ring has to pay. So Unitas had 2 rings. Elway had 2 rings. Montana, of course, has 4. And Marino, not only does Joe know that Marino doesn't have any rings, but Joe prevented Marino from getting a ring in his only chance in the Super Bowl. So it was just a fantastic dick move all the way around. And Marino was like, fuck you. And then he grabs the check.
Yeah. Classic.
I mean, he's literally
silverback,
literally hitting somebody where it hurts most.
Yeah. Yeah. With Brady and Montana, one of the things Brady currently benefits from is recency. Like my kids don't know they've never heard of Ron Jaworski. They don't know Randall Cunningham. I'm an Eagles fan, as you know. And, but they still know a bit of Donovan McNabb and they certainly know Jalen Hurts. So I think Brady just has a lot of benefit from recency, but given 20 years time, all of these things fold into new perspective and he's going to have more Super Bowls, of course, than Montana, but other things get looked at. One of which I know I sent you that Instagram clip of, the great Giants linebacker Lawrence Taylor saying it's Montana all day long over Brady. He's like, that guy stood in the pocket. He knew I was coming for him to take his head off. And he stood in there and he threw it. And he says it was a different game, different sport altogether in those days in the way that, the hits were coming on the quarterbacks. And so LT, even today, would already say it's Montana.
The greatest ever? Yeah, I mean, I think that what happens is they revert to their era.
Yeah.
You see Michael Jordan doing that. He kind of like...
Yeah, or Dr. J. His dream team has like Oscar Robertson on it.
And like Jordan will never kind of give LeBron this full acceptance because of the era LeBron plays in. And Jordan, of course, played in the, Jordan rules Detroit Pistons era, just got his ass kicked. And so players revert to that. And I think that like when you're looking to who's the greatest quarterback ever, there's so many factors. Like I think almost statistics are the ones you throw out the most because they're the most influenced by rule changes and by offense and luck. Like, Joe Montana probably would have had a good career, but if he had been drafted by the Seattle Seahawks and not the 49ers, I don't know if he's getting 4 Super Bowls.
Right. Or imagine if Earl Campbell had Emmitt Smith's position. If he was playing behind that Dallas Cowboys offensive line with Aikman and Irv, Earl Campbell would have been amazing. He was amazing. Would have been even more amazing.
Where I think that like the argument, and I see arguments, I actually think that you could make the argument that Marino and Elway were both better than Joe Montana because they didn't benefit from playing with an innovative coach like Bill Walsh. And yet they still did things that were pretty amazing and that Joe Montana didn't do. But, the problem is when you look at Brady, no matter what category you take, he's done it. And he's probably done it more than anybody else. So you want to say like, if you just look at their impact on the game and throw statistics out, just whose presence helps their teams win the most. I mean, the guy was literally never out of a playoff spot in his entire career.
So cool in the huddle. I think, people say he's better in the crunch. And I think it's actually that he's just this, everyone else sort of collapses or gets a little tight and he just doesn't. He stays the same. Everyone else sort of comes down a bit. And it's like that famous Montana Harris Barton story where he spots John, it's like the craziest, most tense drive of all time. He's like, hey, look, there's John Candy in the stands.
And, Kevin O'Connell, who's the current head coach of the Vikings, was a quarterback in college, great college player, drafted in the NFL and just couldn't hang on. Like he was just cut and he kept he'd get another tryout and he would try to make that great John Elway throw and wow the coaches and he'd get cut again. it always left this like scar on him. And when he got into coaching, he went back and looked at every game-winning drive that Joe Montana and John Elway and Tom Brady had made in big games to try to find a common denominator. And what stood out wasn't that they made these fantastic throws, is that they treated it like it was spring practice. And they just took completions.
Yeah.
Like if it's Joe Montana dumping the ball off to Roger Craig and gaining 7 yards, that's what he did. And then they hit one play that maybe is like a big chunk play, but like great quarterbacking is often about embracing the mundane. And I think that like we watch it and we're so fascinated with all of these different elements of it. And yet for them, they see things very simply, and their job is to just move the ball down the field and get in the end zone. And so when you look at all that stuff, it's like, Brady's done that longer and better than anybody, I think.
Yeah, and it's just cool as a cucumber. Do you ever see that documentary Free Solo about the guy who climbs without ropes?
Yeah, I spent a week with Alex Honnold and his wife. Really? Yeah, I loved it. It was terrific.
That was an amazing documentary, and there was something biological about him, like his adrenal glands. He could not. It just took a different environment for him to even pump adrenaline. He was just. I wonder if there's some measure of that in Montana, Brady, and some of these great quarterbacks where it's like. They just don't give in to an overdose of adrenaline. It takes more than that.
I do think there is, because it's like you're looking at how they think, right? And like I do think that like quarterbacks say it best when they say, when they get a 2-minute drill, there is no pressure. They're already down. You know what I mean? And so they've got nothing to lose. And I think that like it liberated them in a lot of ways. And with Alex, it's interesting because he'll tell you, the thing to take away from that documentary isn't that he's indifferent to death. It was actually that he so didn't want to die that he spent 3+ years memorizing every single crack of El Cap, so that when he did it, it was like essentially muscle memory, and he had mitigated that fear. Like that's the crazy part of him. It isn't that he climbed this wall without a rope. It's that he memorized every single thing. And practiced it. Because remember, there's that key moment in the documentary where he goes up and he starts to climb it and he's like, I'm not feeling it. We're calling it off. And that showed that he didn't want to die. That's where he was like, I'm not feeling it today. We're not doing this. And he went back and kept working and kept trying to memorize this wall to the point where when he did it, it felt like something he had done before, and he had kind of figured out a way to throttle that fear. That's the interesting thing. And quarterbacks are very similar in a lot of ways. I think that also like the borderline sociopathy is something they share.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about process for putting this book together, your other book, and the many pieces and profiles you've done. Clearly for this book, you did a ton of primary research, some maybe specifically for the book and some over the years that you could draw on. But how many interviews did you do? I mean, you must have sat with Elway a number of times, for example. Yeah,
I did. I wrote how many it was in there. It wasn't so much that I did, I know some of the authors who will do a biography on someone and they'll say, hey, I talked to 450 people.
Would you break out the recording device and say, we're on tape? Or how would you sort of set the ground rules?
Oh, yeah, I would do that. And like, I wanted what I wanted. So the way I structured the book is that there are no chapters and there's kind of themes. And I try to weave all of these, a handful of stories of quarterbacks that matter to me, whose stories I found interesting. I try to weave them throughout the book so that you see them talking to each other, so that you see what Caleb Williams is going through in 2023 is the same as what John Elway went through in 1983, is the same that, other guys throughout history went through, so that you kind of get the sense that like time's a flat circle when it comes to quarterbacking. And like, once you take on this job, it doesn't matter if it's 1945 or 2025, they have something in common. I wanted to think about it like, you see those, or you used to see, the gatherings in the White House of all the former presidents. And I used to wonder, like, what do they all talk about? Because they all they know each other's lives, even if they don't have to talk about it. And because they've experienced something that's very unique.
Yeah. No
And I think with great quarterbacks, it's similar in some way, where it's like there are 16,000 high school starting quarterbacks in the country every year. There are 958 at the highest level of college, 32 starters in the NFL, 10 good ones, 3 undisputably great ones at any time. How do you survive that winnowing? How do you go from 16,000 to 3? So even if these guys don't know each other well, they've experienced a certain kind of life together. And that's why I wanted those guys, their stories, to try to talk to each other. So I interviewed a ton of guys, and I actually interviewed a lot of guys that didn't even make it into the book, which I felt bad about, but like they just didn't quite work.
It'd be interesting. I just had this thought of, when you said I interviewed a ton of guys, it just triggered something like you could almost do like the wives of the quarterbacks. Like it'd be interesting to get their perspective, or the girlfriends, I guess.
I did,
cases, or the many girls.
Yeah, I did. I did in some cases because she wouldn't sit down with me, but I interview. I write about Arch Manning as a way in his recruitment to Texas as a way to write about all the Mannings, and I really wanted to interview Olivia Manning, Archie's wife, because she must know something that nobody else knows about.
Yeah.
What makes great quarterbacks. But I'll give you, for instance, like Andrew Luck. So Andrew Luck is kind of a minor character in the book, but he is most famous for being great and then for retiring early. And in the time that I spent with him, what I realized is that he walked away because he didn't like who he was as a quarterback. Like, yes, he was injured, but he would have recovered. It was that nobody tells you how you're supposed to be a great quarterback. And so you have to kind of figure it out on your own. And he was so ruthless and so single-minded and so selfish, that when he got injured, it gave him a chance to step back and look at his life and realize, like, I don't kind of like who I am as a quarterback. I'm kind of a dick. And I kind of I make the world revolve around me. And so his girlfriend at the time was ready to leave him because he wouldn't communicate with her. And because even though she knew what this job entailed and how much pressure was on him, she needed someone who was who he was when he was retired, which was someone who could like access these parts of his personality that he didn't as a quarterback. And so he came back after he was injured and thought he did a good job of like being a person that he liked and being a quarterback. And then he got hurt again and he just reverted. Mm-hmm. And that's when he walked away. And so I found that fascinating because she was really helpful in reporting that, his wife, Nicole, because she was someone who saw this life in this world from the point of view of a spouse. And even though she knew how much pressure he was under, there became a breaking point for her. And I thought that was really fascinating. Like at one point I looked at like all of the Hall of Fame quarterbacks to see if they were divorced more often than the national average. As it turns out, it was like kind of about the same, if I remember right. But like there's so much pressure on quarterbacks and so much expectation and scrutiny and blame and fame and adulation and opportunity, and temptation. There's so much of that like they have to figure out a way for the world to revolve around them to survive it. And that's really incompatible with life away from football.
On process, just stepping away from the book for 1 second and just your broader writing, how do you know when you want to do, a piece versus a series of pieces versus something that could become a book? And then, along the same lines, how do you know how you want your way in to be, when you're watching a season or a game, how do you know if the essence of what you want to tell is about an event or if the essence is about a person?
Yeah. For this book, a character had to be one of 3 things. They either had to be someone who was so important to the idea of quarterback, like Johnny Unitas or Joe Namath, that you can't write about it without writing about them. Mm-hmm. Or they had to be someone that I was personally, I had to tell their story, like John Elway, like Warren Moon, and there are some others in there. Or they had to be someone, even if I wasn't exactly interested in their story, I was interested in their situation. So like Caleb Williams being the first superstar multimillionaire at USC, or Arch Manning, this kid Colin Hurley, who wanted to be the most precocious quarterback ever and like has a near-death experience in part because of that in the book. So those were the standards that I set. And I think that like, I wish that I was that organized, that like I knew something important when I see it like that. But usually it's, you reflect and you're like, as writing books, you have to boil things down to the essence as much as you can and then explain the essence, ride that wave until it rides out. And that's what I tried to do. But like I said, if I knew all of this stuff so efficiently, it would have been so much easier to report, and I wouldn't have taken so many of the trips I took to visit guys who actually didn't even end up making it in the book.
Yeah. Well, you did do so many interviews, and obviously access is important. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about the secrecy of the NFL. So was there any diciness and, flying too close to the sun? You can't reveal, you have to be very careful. It's almost like a political journalist. They can't rip on the president too much because they need access to the president. You piss this person off and there goes your access. So you write a piece that upsets Roger Goodell or Coach Belichick, and all of a sudden you can't get back in the locker room to, have access that you need.
Yeah, that's something that I've, made peace with, over the course of my life, that like, I think that,
Has anyone been upset about either this book or your Patriots book?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah. I think I would have heard. I think that like I've done, I've been in Tom Brady's living room, and I've also reported on things that Tom Brady didn't like and, didn't want out there about his relationship with Bill Belichick.
Today and
I don't know if he will, but like I feel like my job as a journalist, is to, again, reduce that gap between the sport that they love most and they know about least. And so I think that like the main thing is that as a journalist, you have a responsibility to be fair and accurate. And the fairness part of things is where, I'm not successful all the time, but I really try. I really try to get someone's point of view. If there's a piece of reporting, like, Warren Moon, he dealt with horrific things as a child, horrific things. Like one of the reasons why I want to tell Warren Moon story is because we've kind of gotten like, poor ex-quarterback who was barely recruited out of high school or had to wait till the third round till they were picked. Warren Moon was getting death threats in high school. He had to take a bus to a different school for an opportunity to not only play quarterback, but to live. Because he grew up in South Central LA, and he took a bus to a place in, it was like an hour away that was more sort of in West LA. And he dealt with so much pressure and racism and expectation and all of these factors. And he did it well in some ways and not well in other ways. And he's had a lot of well-documented issues with women. And I felt like that was part of his story. And I felt like I had to talk to him about these things and try to, when I'm piecing together my picture of Warren Moon, account for them, because that's part of it. That's part of his story. And that's part of his life as a quarterback, is that like he endured these things that no child should really have to go through. But people got hurt in his quest to greatness. Like he got hurt and other people got hurt too. And I had to explore that. And so I think that like when you do that, again, it's not about, what I try to do is not worry so much, are they going to be upset? More so that like, I want to go right at it and I want to try to understand their point of view as best I can.
So you have sat down with Moon before?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, okay. Was he a first ballot Hall of Famer?
He was.
Yeah.
And that surprised him. It was one of the touching moments in the book, is because he was the first black quarterback for whom greatness was expected. Like there have been other black quarterbacks, but he was the first one that they expected to be a lightning bolt. Mm-hmm. And at every turn, he had to wait for his chance. Whether it was starting in high school was pretty fast, but he still had to wait. He had to go to a junior college for a year before he got his crack to be at a major school as a passing quarterback. He had to go to the CFL to play quarterback because he was worried that the NFL would force him to play a different position. So he always had to wait. And he was always, that was one of...
How many years in the CFL.
I think he was 6, if I remember right.
So
I think
he would have had a huge stats in the NFL if he was in there.
Huge stats. He played till he was 41 and played football. So when you wait 5 years, the 5 years is the earliest you can get in from the moment you retire to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And he thought, just because of the way his career went, that he wasn't going to get in the first time around. Mm-hmm. And, when he got that call that he was a first ballot Hall of Famer, he was in Detroit at the Super Bowl when the Seahawks played the Steelers and it was snowing and he pulled over and just bawled. And, he survived. And there's pros and cons of this, but by bottling everything up inside and never showing emotion. And of course, there's problems with that mentality, and he learned them the hard way. But he finally let out something very primal. And it was a real touching moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a bit in the book here as well. All right. Before we get into the lightning round, I want to ask you a little bit about NFL fashion and what is going on there. I think we all trace it back to Joe Namath and his fur coats and whatnot. And your writing, by the way, is great in the book. Like just line by line, you describe Namath's hair. He had bulky, dangerous hair, which is so exactly gets it. And then we see it, through the years. Like Brady, he kept coming with new haircuts, and it's as though he completely handed over his rights to dress himself. I think like Giselle was just putting him some other crazy outfits. The way into the stadium became like a catwalk, and he'd show up in these things. And now Kelce's doing the same thing, showing up in these crazy, crazy outfits. But I guess that goes to part of the celebrity.
I wish that I had a great answer for why these people make these fashion choices, but I do remember Brady. We were, about the same age, graduated from high school and college the same year, and I covered the Patriots a lot during that early period. And so I got to know Tom a lot during that rise. And, I would see him, and I remember I saw him, like he was maybe a month into starting for the Patriots. Like at that point, nobody even knew if he was going to finish the season. Right. And he's wearing like sweats and, carrying a backpack like a college student. And then the next time I saw him, he had won the Super Bowl MVP, dating Tara Reid. His life had changed. Next time I see him,
there was Tara Reid before Bridget Moynihan.
There was a Tara Reid. Okay. There was a Tara Reid era, but like, his hair was highlighted. He, had the perfect Clooney scruff, cashmere sweaters. It's like things had changed for him, and I think that he learned from Michael Jordan the importance of, what it might do for your image to wear nice clothes behind the podium. And I think that like, that's something that I don't think Brady was like as commercial as Jordan, but it was something that definitely crossed his mind. And I think that like, he
really leaned into that. It was
leaned into
one thing to look kind of nice.
He was in GQ.
Tom Landry put a suit on, but
he was in GQ, carrying goats. At one point, during the photo shoot, I mean, Belichick said to him, like, just because they ask you to do it, you don't have to say yes. But he was one of those guys who I think that like, again, I'm not talking about my book's not about the greatest quarterbacks ever, although I do write about a lot of them. It's about this. What makes them different and what makes them so culturally appreciated and scrutinized, and the way they carry themselves is part of that. Joe Namath, I spent a lot of time with him, and, the hard elements of his life after retirement, the drinking, the divorce. But he was the first quarterback who turned this job into a lifestyle. He evolved Johnny Unitas. Johnny Unitas was kind of the bedrock establishment, and Joe Namath was straight 1960s rebellion and danger, and he scared the shit out of some people, but he had a star power. Like, he was drafted by the Jets to the AFL and given a $427,000 contract, by far the biggest that had ever been handed out in professional sports. And the guy who owned the Jets was this businessman named Sonny Werblin, and he studied what made people in America buy things. And that was like one of the most, he was a salesman, and he realized that one of the allures, one of the things that made people stars was if they were rich. And so he paid Joe Namath this contract, not even knowing if he was going to be a quarterback, because they actually drafted another quarterback that same year from Notre Dame, guy who won the Heisman. So they hedged their bets on Joe. They didn't know if Joe was going to be a good quarterback. They knew he would be a star. And that to me is interesting. And when you're
telling, pay him a lot for the press release about how much they're paying him. Like that's
exactly
if you can get it.
Exactly. And like, that's part of what made quarterback what it is. That's what, it added that intrigue, whether you can't stand this asshole because he's making this much money, or you're enamored with him because he's wearing the tights and the fur coats and, he kind of is dangerous and he's rich and dangerous. Whatever it was, Werblin wanted the quarterback to have that cachet.
All right, last question, I promise, before the lightning round. The NFL halftime shows.
Yeah.
Why are they such a circus? I remember thinking, like, I confuse Dick Butkus and Mike Ditka sometimes, but they're both of them have this image of toughness and gruffness, and then they put him in this 4-seater desk, and everyone starts acting like utter goofballs, like hyper energy and silly. Why is it so silly?
The halftime show?
Yeah. I mean, it's fun and energetic and all that. It's like kind of get it. But even like Howie Long, Terry Bradshaw's a total maniac, and I love Bradshaw. But there's almost zero seriousness about it. They're so zany.
It is, and it's interesting because I think that what happened was that you got on television if you were entertaining, like Dandy Don Meredith, Namath for an extent. It's like they needed that mix of. Again, it's kind of similar to what Werblin was thinking of with Namath, where it's like you tune into someone for a reason, whether you love them or hate them, you just have to kind of pay attention to them. Yeah. And now I think it's interesting because there's that, but there's also been this hard turn towards the X's and O's and trying to explain this football minutia, which is fascinating in its own right because it's really hard. Like your boy, Ron Jaworski, one of the smartest football minds I've ever met. I mean, that guy grinds. He lives in Philadelphia. NFL Films is in Philadelphia. I mean, that was his office. Mm-hmm. He would go there and watch tape and try to think about strategy and scheme and personnel. And he was so good at it. And yet he wasn't one of those announcers that we had to listen to. Mm-hmm. It's like, people listen, like Tony Romo, someone who's really figured out a way to split the difference between the two of them because he can be entertaining and yet he can tell you they're going to run left here.
Yeah, and he's right often.
He's totally right.
When he's right, he looks like a genius. Yeah. All right, on to the lightning round as promised. Your favorite book as a kid?
As a young kid, I was a big Super Fudge fan. I would say that the first book that was an adult book that I remember reading was, and this is hilarious, being in Anchorage, Alaska, was Bright Lights, Big City.
Oh, yeah.
I was a big Michael J. Fox fan. Growing up, I loved Back to the Future and, comb my hair to look like Michael when I was a kid. And he did that movie. Yeah. And so I heard about this book, so I just picked it up and here I am pretty young. Yeah, I want to say maybe 11 or 12, and I'm reading about cocaine and drinking and all that. Yeah. I was like, okay, I don't know if this is all for me, but I really, it was written all in second person, which is a fascinating kind of literary device and something that
the great Jay McInerney
is unbelievable.
Yeah. That was interesting casting, by the way, Michael J. Fox for that role.
Yeah, he did. I think he did a good job.
He's great. Book or books you're reading now?
Oh man, I've read a ton. So I just read Michael J. Fox's actually. I've been reading a ton because
he did a bio. He talks about Back to the Future and Family Ties.
Yeah, just the filming of it. So that was I read one, that was the most recent one I read. And before that, why am I read a book by my friend Chuck Klosterman called Football. Which won't be out till January, but he did a fantastic job with it. So that was it. It's kind of about football and how it's an appreciation of football with the subtext that its success might end up dooming it, which is really a fascinating conceit.
All right, well, I'm going to call him for a galley and we'll have him on here for some scotch. All right, you imagine you are a GM of an NFL team, and you're putting together an all-time team of players in their prime. So pick one QB, one quarterback, one running. By the way, I meant to note this earlier. It's interesting to track the evolution of the position quarterback by the spelling of the word. It's initially two words, then it's hyphenated, and then we have our sort of modern one-word quarterback. A little more to...
Sure. So to get me over the line. Yeah. So quarterback and what other positions?
one quarterback, one running back, one wide receiver, and then one middle linebacker or linebacker, defensive line.
Okay. So quarterback, I would take. I think you have to take someone who could just play in any offense with anybody at a high level. I would take Elway in his prime.
Okay. Running back.
Oh man, one. I mean, I really want to say Bo Jackson because I mean that guy was unbelievable. I think you got to go with. I'd go with Walter Payton. I mean, you know, again, you're looking at guys who were on bad teams and could carry it on their own. Peyton or Barry Sanders were like those guys. I would go with Peyton.
Okay. Walter Payton. So wide receiver.
I really want to say Randy Moss, but I'll go with. I really want to say Jerry Rice, but I'll go with Randy Moss.
He was an amazing.
Yeah, he could jump a little bit more.
Oh my gosh! I mean, our kids actually still say I don't know if they've ever seen him, but if you jump up and catch a ball over the defender, you mossed him.
Yeah.
Linebacker.
I know there's a lot of them. I mean, you know, it's a tie between Ray Lewis and Lawrence Taylor.
Mm-hmm. D-line.
Man, there's a lot of good ones. Can I move Lawrence Taylor to defensive end? Oh man. Jeez, there's so many good ones.
For me, it's Reggie
White. I'll go with Reggie. That's a good one because he played on some bad teams and he was always a star. And like
you couldn't have one guy block him. You two or three.
I always look. You know, you got to look. Football is such a team game and it's so interconnected that it's impossible to kind of separate without the sweater getting unthreaded. But like,
that's true. I mean, it's hard for a linebacker to look good if they've got no defensive line.
But Reggie was just always, you know, you always had to account for him no matter what.
Yeah. How about safety or cornerback? Consolidate those.
Yeah. Well, if it's safety, I'll go with Ronnie Lott. And if it's corner, I'll go with Dion. I mean, Dion changed the game. You know, that guy was a differentiator on 2 different Super Bowl teams. Mm-hmm. Just a phenomenal player that, like, you know, I think that, like, he was the shutdown corner. Like, he started that, and he was also a phenomenal punt returner and a good wide receiver when he got the chance.
Yeah. I mean, there was that, I've read some article where the Cowboys wanted to get him after he beat him. And so they go to Michael Irvin like, hey, we're going to probably pay this guy a lot of money. You okay? He's like, go get him. Go get him. I want that guy on my team. All right, here's an interesting question because it's a little bit in the news lately. Is the CTE controversy fading or is the worst yet to come for the NFL?
I mean, I think the narrative of it is fading a little bit because we had that era, right, where it was just constantly there. And I think that, like, college and pro football, to their credit, have done a lot to change the game to lessen the impact on the head. Mm-hmm. And but it is an inherently violent sport. And I think that so much of the country actually, if they have a frustration with football, I think that so much of the country thinks it's not violent enough. Like, that's what they like. And so
they want to get back to the Jack Lambert days.
Exactly. And so I think that, like, there's that tension in the country. And I think that, like, the CTE factor is impossible to ignore. So the 2023, the Washington Post does a story about high school tackle football participation levels in every state, and only 2 were up that year. Mm-hmm. Like, the decline is unquestionable. And I think that my colleagues, Mark Fainaru, Wada, and Steve Fainaru,
the high school level, but not, I mean, the appeal of
the appeal is bigger than ever. Yeah. But that's the interesting thing, is that, like, it's so popular in the NFL, so popular in college, popular in high school in a different way. But, like, teams are thinning, and my colleagues have written about it. But, like, the insurance rates for high school teams might continue to climb. And that could be a really scary moment.
More teams.
That could be a really scary moment because a lot of this is public money. And if, like, people just say, like, we shouldn't be paying this much in insurance for high school kids to bang their heads into each other, that could be a real problem for college and pro football in the future.
Yeah. Well, there's that. And also, I think parental awareness of the risk causes a lot of parents to pull their kids out of football. So, you know, the funnel, as you speak of, going from 13th, whatever the number was, down to 3 quarterbacks, the funnel just sort of tightens at the wide end, but coming out the other end is kind of unchanged. The NFL appeal is still there. There just might not be a million kids playing. There's 600,000.
That's what makes it fascinating, right? It's because I think in 2024, 93 out of the top 100 programs on television were football games.
Wow.
And either college or the NFL. And 23. 24, it was a little bit less because of the debates, but they were still pretty far up there, the presidential debates. But, its appeal is unquestioned, but at the grassroots level, I think there are some issues. And I think that's one of the reasons why the NFL is trying to get flag football started so much, because I think they realize that...
Is that already an Olympic sport? There's something
It's going to be an Olympic sport, yeah.
Well, the other risk is if they are able to diagnose CTE in a living person, then that...
Michael said that here, I think, in this, on your podcast. And I think that, from what I know, that's not anywhere close. But that is a huge deal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Along the lines of these most watched games, the greatest football game ever played.
Writing about quarterbacks, this might seem surprising, but I like defensive games because it's so easy to score nowadays that I actually like it when games are the defense makes things really hard. So I got to go greatest game ever played. It's got to have high stakes. It's got to have great defense. I would say probably the Patriots Super Bowl against the Rams, the first one.
The first one that they won.
So
Kurt Warner for the Rams, Brady.
Unbelievable offense for the Rams coming into New Orleans. They're thinking they're going to be the next dynasty. In New England, you have, this plucky group of unrestricted free agents and this 6th-round quarterback. And Belichick devised this game plan. Marshall Faulk was the best player on the field for the Rams. And he devised a game plan where we're hitting Faulk on every play. It doesn't matter if he has the ball or not, because he realized that the offense kind of ran through Faulk even when he wasn't holding the ball, when he wasn't getting a handoff. And so Belichick beat the hell out of him, made them play. This is great basketball phrase, but it's Belichick always made you play left-handed. Mm-hmm. And that defensive performance held on just enough. The Rams figured it out at the end and they were just able to hang on. But to me, that was a real...
it's a chess match.
It's a chess match, but it's you look at plays and you always, on a successful play, you think player. If the receiver is wide open, it's play. If the receiver makes this unbelievable catch like Randy Moss did between 3 guys, it's player. Mm-hmm. That game was pure play to me. It was just the players obviously made the plays, but the coaches for the Patriots were pretty close to flawless in that game.
All right, speaking of Belichick, how many more games will Belichick coach at UNC? What is the over-under on his tenure there?
He'll definitely, unless they don't want him, he'll definitely coach next year, I think. And so I don't know how many games that is, 11, but I think he'll definitely coach next year. And I think that even though what people are picking on from the outside is his girlfriend and the fact that they're losing and, being a little bit of someone who's studied and fascinated with Belichick and all the ways that flatter him and all the ways that don't, i.e. Spygate. What fascinates me most about Bill is that this is the guy who coined the phrase "on to Cincinnati," right? I mean, he was so good at helping his team focus on the task at hand and not the noise. Mm-hmm. He kind of embraces the noise now. I mean, I don't know what goes on in the locker room there at Carolina. Has he not lost a step? He's still that guy and he can do it. I mean, I don't know what the deal is with this girlfriend. Maybe, that's a whole other thing. But I think that what's interesting is that he's so upset about how things ended in New England and the way that he was treated by Kraft and, all of these things that happened over the years, that he's kind of open to letting it play out in public. And the Patriots, Bill Belichick, would have never, ever let that happen. Whereas now you saw the report where Patriots scouts are banned at UNC. Mm-hmm. And he was asked about it. And he not only confirmed that that was true, but he was like, well, I'm not welcome in their building, so they're not welcome in mine. And that to me with Belichick is different. The Belichick that we've known and been fascinated with, who's been in the public eye since 2000, would have never said something like that. Mm-hmm. And, here he is just kind of willing to entertain it.
Well, all right. So at least one more season after this one.
That's what I think.
All right. Last question for Seth Wickersham. One piece of advice for the audience.
Oh man. Drink Johnny Walker Blue. How about that?
That's a good start.
I mean, I think that it's a tough time for a lot of people in America for a host of different reasons. But I think that finding the ways to escape, and get through life in the ways that they can, as long as it's healthy and productive, are the best things you can do. I mean, you and I were talking about skiing, before we came on air. I mean, go skiing. I mean, my God, there's nothing better than being outside. You can't be on your phone. You're completely disconnected from the world, and it's you in the mountain. And there's just something really beautiful about that. And finding your versions of that, I think, are important.
Oh, that's great. Seth, thank you for coming in. Congrats on the book, American Kings. It's a great read, and it's great to meet you.
My pleasure, man. Thank you.